I don't want to feed an extra mouth, Derek said, his voice slicing through the dimly lit dining room like a blade. And then he laughed a sharp, cruel laugh that made the silverware on the table vibrate in my ears. The smell of roasted chicken still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of cornbread. But suddenly, everything tasted like ashes in my mouth. I was 62 years old. Gloria Matthews, a widow who had given every drop of sweat to raise that boy. And there he sat at the head of the table, grinning, mocking me, as though I were nothing more than a burden, dragging behind his shiny new life. His wife Sabrina leaned closer to him, her lips curling in agreement, and I saw in her eyes the kind of cold calculation that used to send shivers down my spine when I worked the night shift at the hospital and caught sight of a patient's family already dividing the inheritance before the body had cooled. My hands trembled under the table, not from weakness, but from a rage so sharp it burned against my ribs. I remembered the nights I stitched wounds on strangers for minimum wage while Derek slept safe at home. I remembered the loans I took to pay for his college when I could barely keep the lights on. I remembered pawning my wedding ring to buy him a suit for his first job interview. And yet in his eyes now I was no longer mother, no longer sacrifice, no longer flesh and blood. I was an extra mouth. The phrase echoed in my head, bouncing against the walls of memory until it felt like the room itself was sneering at me. He stabbed at his plate with his fork, chuckling. "We need to think smart, Mom. You've had your time. Now it's ours. You should be grateful we even let you sit here." The words hit harder than any physical slap could, and for a moment I wanted to vanish, to curl into the shadows of the corner where the family photos hung. My late husband's portrait stared down from the wall, his steady eyes seeming to ask if this was the son we had raised together, if this was the fruit of decades of labor and prayer. Sabrina placed her manicured hand on Derek's arm and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "She'll understand eventually. Old people always cling to what's theirs, but we'll fix that." They laughed together, two hyenas circling their prey, and I sat frozen, my heart thundering so violently I thought the table would shake. My daughter Angela shifted uncomfortably on the far end, her eyes darting between us, but she said nothing. Silence is betrayal too, and in that silence I realized I stood alone. The high-pitched ring of Sabrina's laugh tore at my eardrums, and all I could taste was bitterness, all I could smell was the metallic tang of rage rising in my throat. An extra mouth, I repeated silently, gripping my napkin so hard the threads came loose. In that instant, the decades of exhaustion of bending my back until it nearly broke for them turned to steel inside me. They thought I was powerless, a tired old woman waiting to be tucked away in some corner. But deep within me, hidden behind layers of patience and quiet endurance, lay something they had never seen, something they could never imagine. My secret was not only survival, it was power. And while they laughed, I stared down at my plate and let my fury settle into a cold, calculating silence. For if they wanted war, they had just declared it, and they would learn soon enough that an extra mouth could roar louder than all their greed combined. I had come to that dinner expecting warmth, not war. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of night when families should draw close after church and share stories across steaming plates, and I had spent the morning convincing myself that despite Derek's sharp tongue and Sabrina's icy glares, blood might still bind us. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons, a dress my late husband once said made me look like I belonged to a different era of grace. I thought maybe if I looked dignified enough, they would see me as a mother again instead of a burden. I even baked peach cobbler, Derek's childhood favorite, because in my heart I still believed that food carried memory, and memory softened hearts. The moment I walked through the door, though, I felt the tension. Sabrina's eyes slid over me with the same disdain one might reserve for an unwelcome guest, and Derek's smile was forced a twitch at the corner of his mouth that never reached his eyes. "Angela." My daughter greeted me quietly, but her voice was small, swallowed by the heavy silence that hung between us. As we sat down, I noticed the subtle changes Sabrina had placed herself at Derek's right hand, her manicured fingers wrapped around his like a vice, her jewelry flashing under the chandelier. She had carved herself a throne in a house I once thought of as mine, and she wanted me to see it. Derek cleared his throat and launched into talk of the new villa they were eyeing in Charleston, boasting about the open floor plan and the marble kitchen island as if every sentence was an advertisement for the life he thought he deserved. Sabrina chimed in about entertaining guests, about needing space for future children, her smile dripping with false sweetness, but the way she glanced at me told a different story. I was the obstacle to their paradise. I tried to bring up memories, light things like how Derek once begged me for peach cobbler after football practice, how he used to sneak into the kitchen at midnight for another slice. My words fell flat. He shrugged, barely listening, and Sabrina shifted the subject back to mortgages and investments. Then the conversation veered subtle at first, then sharper. Derek asked about my house, the one I had lived in for 40 years, the one his father and I had built with calloused hands and long weekends of sweat equity. "It's too big for you alone, Mom," he said casually, but his tone carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Sabrina added, "You'd be so much happier in a retirement condo. Let us handle the stress. We could use that equity to secure the villa. It would be for the whole family." Her words were coated with the sugary tone of fake concern, but her eyes glittered with hunger. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I looked around that table and realized this was not a family dinner, it was an ambush. They had dressed it up with roast chicken and cornbread, but underneath it was a negotiation, a power grab, a declaration that my time was over. I glanced at Angela, hoping for support, but she lowered her eyes and busied herself with her plate. The silence pressed on me like a weight heavier than any night shift I had ever endured. I realized then the reality: they did not see me as a matriarch, as the woman who had carried them through storms and hunger and funerals. They saw me as a wallet they had not yet emptied, a deed they had not yet claimed. The smell of food, once comforting, now turned rancid in my nose. Every laugh of Derek's, every glance Sabrina stole at him was a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I had expected love. I had expected some shred of gratitude. Instead, I found calculation, disdain, and the slow erasure of my place in my own bloodline. That contrast cut through me with brutal clarity, and though my heart ached, a colder part of me began to stir. If they wanted to strip me of my dignity, they would discover that I had more left to give than they ever imagined, and it would not be cobbler or comfort. It would be consequences. When I sat there staring at Derek's smirk, the word useless echoing in my ears, a flood of memories crashed against me with such force that I had to grip the edge of my chair to keep from trembling. I thought back to the winter of 1989 when Derek was just a boy with a runny nose and dreams too big for our tiny house. I worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, scrubbing floors and holding the hands of dying strangers because the pay was steadier than any promise his father could keep after he passed. I remember dragging my tired body home at dawn, the scent of bleach still clinging to my uniform, and standing in the kitchen cooking oatmeal so Derek and his little sister Angela would have something warm before school. My hands were cracked, bleeding sometimes, but I never let them see me cry. When Derek begged for sneakers like the other boys had, I cut coupons and skipped meals until I could buy them, and the way his face lit up made every hunger pang worth it. Later, when he was a teenager, he slammed doors and called me strict because I refused to let him run with boys who carried knives and trouble in their pockets. I remember sitting up in bed, listening to the creak of the floorboards, praying he had come home safe. I remember the night the police knocked at my door, asking about a fight at a party, and I stood there in my nightgown defending him, swearing my son was better than the streets that tried to swallow him. I carried those scars like medals. When it came time for college, Derek chose a school out of state, and though my savings barely touched tuition, I signed the loans anyway. I took a second job at the nursing home mopping floors after 12-hour hospital shifts just so I could send him money for books. My back ached, my knees swelled, but I told myself that was the price of seeing my son in a cap and gown. I pawned the only piece of jewelry I had left from my husband, my wedding ring, to buy him a suit for interviews, and I remember standing in the pawn shop parking lot with tears sliding down my face, telling myself it was just metal, not memory, and that Derek's future was worth more. When he married Sabrina, I gave him every dime I had saved, cash folded in an envelope, so he could have the kind of wedding I never did. I wore a borrowed dress and smiled through the ceremony, watching him beam beside his bride, thinking I had finally reached the end of sacrifice and could step into peace. But peace never came. Derek climbed fast at his firm, but he called less, visited less, and when he did, it was always with requests hidden inside complaints. Mom, can you babysit Mom? We need help with the down payment. Mom, you don't understand how expensive everything is. And every time I gave what little I had, because mothers do not measure love in dollars, they measure it in sleepless nights and empty plates and quiet pride. But sitting at that dinner table watching my son laugh at me, I realized he had never seen it that way. To him, my sacrifices were invisible, my struggles irrelevant. The house I fought to keep, the bills I scraped, to pay the hours I bled away in antiseptic corridors, none of it mattered. He believed he built himself that I was just the extra mouth now clinging to a home he thought he deserved. My chest tightened with the cruelty of it, but then a sharper thought cut through. If he could erase decades of sacrifice with one laugh, then I could turn those decades into a weapon. He had forgotten who raised him, but I had not forgotten what I endured, and endurance is a kind of power. I sat there, the ghosts of long nights whispering in my ears, and I swore silently that the woman who once starved so he could eat would not starve again. Not for him, not for anyone. He had taken my love for granted, but he was about to learn that a mother's silence is never empty. It is loaded with memory, with pain, and with the kind of strength no amount of greed can shatter. The night after that dinner, I could not sleep. The house was too quiet, the tick of the clock too loud, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard Derek's laugh, sharp and mocking, calling me an extra mouth. I rose before dawn and made tea, my hands trembling as I poured water over the leaves, and I stared out the kitchen window at the old oak tree where Derek once built a crooked tree house. It had rotted years ago, but I could still see him waving from the branches a boy who once called me his hero. Now that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose heart had calcified around greed. A week later, I visited their house carrying a basket of groceries because Angela had said Sabrina was sick. I wanted to believe I was still needed, that I still had a role beyond being a nuisance. But when I stepped inside, the air smelled of perfume and wine, not illness. Voices drifted from the living room low at first, then clearer as I moved closer. I froze when I heard my name. "We can't wait much longer," Sabrina hissed, her voice dripping with impatience. "That house is worth at least $500,000, Derek. We sell it, we secure the villa. If she refuses, we move her into a home. There are ways to make her sign." My chest tightened. Derek's reply came calm, practiced. "She's stubborn, but she's tired. We'll convince her she can't handle it alone. A few bills piling up, a few late notices, she'll cave. And if not," he paused, and in the silence, I heard the scrape of his glass on the table. "We'll handle it. Sabrina, I know people. Paperwork can be signed without her even realizing." Sabrina laughed that same shrill laugh from the dinner table. "Perfect. She'll be out of the way, and we'll finally have what we deserve." The words were knives slicing into my spine. I backed away, clutching the basket so hard the handle bit into my palm. My groceries spilled apples rolling across the tile, and Sabrina's footsteps clicked as she came to see. I ducked behind the doorway, heart-pounding breath shallow, waiting until she passed. Their whispers grew faint again, but I had already heard enough to unravel whatever hope I clung to. They did not just see me as an extra mouth. They saw me as prey, a possession to be moved, manipulated, erased. I staggered back to my car, every step heavier than the last, and when I sat behind the wheel, my vision blurred with tears. I wanted to scream, to storm back inside and demand answers, but another voice inside me, colder and sharper, told me to wait. They thought me weak, frail, incapable of defending what I had built. That would be my advantage. That night, I tore through old boxes in my attic, the smell of dust and cedar rising as I opened the chest I had kept locked for years. Inside were deeds, shares, documents no one knew about, records of investments my late husband and I had made before he passed. For decades, I had hidden them, telling myself I wanted Derek and Angela to make their own way, never to lean on inherited fortune. But now, with betrayal ringing in my ears, I realized those papers were no longer just memories, they were ammunition. I ran my fingers over the embossed seals, the faded ink of signatures that bound me to power far greater than Derek could imagine, and I whispered to the empty attic, "If you want war, son, you will have it." In the stillness, I felt something shift inside me. The pain of betrayal had hardened into resolve, and beneath it all, a spark of grim satisfaction flared. They thought they could erase me, but I had been erasing pain all my life, stitching wounds, burying hunger, swallowing grief. I knew how to endure, but more importantly, I knew how to fight when cornered. And this time, I would not fight with tears or pleas. I would fight with the one thing they worshipped most: money. I sat in the attic with the documents spread across the floor, the yellow lamplight pooling over the faded papers, and for the first time in years, my tears dried into something harder than sorrow. Hurt had been my companion too long, wrapping me in silence while the people I loved chipped away at me. But that night, staring at deeds and share certificates and rental contracts worth more than Derek or Sabrina could dream, the hurt burned off like fog under the sun. What was left was cold anger, sharp as broken glass and steadier than the trembling of my hands. They thought I was powerless, a lonely widow clinging to the past, but I had the one language they understood fluently: money. My late husband and I had built Ellis Care with sweat and risk, and though I had kept my shares hidden, I still owned 20% of a company that supplied half the nursing homes in the state. I had bought properties quietly over the years too, 2 duplexes and a warehouse I leased to a trucking firm. I had kept quiet because I wanted my children to carve their own lives, but now I realized my silence had raised a monster who mistook humility for weakness. I pressed my palm against the deed to my house, the one Derek wanted to strip from me, and whispered, "This will never be yours." The coldness inside me whispered back that silence would no longer protect me, only strategy would. That night, I called Rachel Porter, an attorney who had once helped me draft a small trust for Angela's children. Her voice was brisk, professional, but when I told her I suspected Derek and Sabrina were plotting to take my home, her tone sharpened with steel. "Do not sign anything," she said. "Bring me every paper you have, every deed, every account. If they push, we will push back." I felt my spine straighten at her words. For the first time in weeks, I was not alone. The next day, I called Leon Carter, a childhood friend who had gone into private investigation after leaving the force. He came to my porch with his notebook, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, and when I told him about overhearing Sabrina and Derek, his jaw clenched. "Let me do some digging," he said. "If they're planning something dirty, we'll catch them before they blink." As I watched him drive away, I felt something shift deep inside me. The fear that had wrapped around my chest loosened, replaced by a simmering purpose. I no longer trembled at Derek's words. Instead, I played them back in my mind like a recording cataloging every insult, every slip, every cruel laugh. Each one was fuel. At Sunday service, I looked at him across the pews, Sabrina clinging to his arm like a queen beside her king, and I lowered my eyes, pretending deference. Inside, though, I was already mapping the war. They wanted to strip me of dignity by force. I would strip them of dignity by truth. They wanted to paint me as a burden. I would reveal myself as their reckoning. That shift from mother's pain to warrior's anger was not loud, not fiery, but cold, deliberate, and unstoppable. I knew the battle would not be short, but endurance had been my gift all along, and this time, endurance would be the blade I pressed to their pride. The first step of revenge was patience. And patience was something I had mastered through decades of 12-hour shifts and nights when hunger gnawed at me louder than sleep. So I let Derek and Sabrina believe I was bending to them. When they mentioned again that my house was too large, I sighed and murmured that perhaps they were right, that I was tired, that maybe downsizing was the answer. I watched Sabrina's eyes light up like a predator catching the scent of blood, and I forced my lips into a small smile, masking the satisfaction in my chest. I began to act the part they had written for me, the frail old mother who needed guidance. When Derek suggested I let him review my mail to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed, I handed him an envelope deliberately stuffed with old grocery coupons and outdated bills. He puffed his chest, believing he was already in control. Behind his back, I met with Rachel and signed documents locking my house into an irrevocable trust, placing it beyond his reach. The papers were thick, the ink bold, and when my pen scratched across the line, it felt like armor sliding onto my shoulders. Phase 1 was complete. I let them see weakness while securing my strength. The second step was humiliation, subtle enough to sting, but not yet to cripple. Derek bragged one evening that he had arranged a meeting with a real estate agent to discuss selling my property. I promised I would be there to sign, then conveniently arrived an hour late, dressed in my work clothes from volunteering at the church food pantry. The agent sat stiff, irritated while Derek stammered excuses. Sabrina's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. I apologized sweetly, playing the doddering widow who lost track of time, but in my chest I savored their embarrassment. The agent left unimpressed, and word trickled back through the community that Derek's big claims were nothing but air. A small bruise to his ego, but bruises accumulate. I fed Leon the scraps of their schemes, and he returned with recording Sabrina on the phone with a notary asking how signatures could be expedited. Derek muttering about forging my name if necessary. Hearing my own son contemplate crime against me was a blade twisting deeper, but it also armed me. Each recording, each document Leon gathered was a bullet in the chamber of justice. The third step, the killing blow, required timing. I waited for the night of Derek's company anniversary, a grand affair at a rented hall where he planned to flaunt success before investors and friends. He strutted through the room in a tailored suit I had once sacrificed to buy him the confidence to climb Sabrina sparkling at his side, their laughter loud and hollow. When the speeches began, he took the stage, raising his glass to boast of his bright future, the villa, the investments, the legacy he claimed he was building. That was when I rose slow but steady, and the microphone found my hand. The room hushed, eyes turned, and Derek's smile faltered. My voice, calm and deliberate, carried across the hall. I told them of the trust, holding my home the shares of Ellis Care. I had preserved the properties I had built, while they sneered at me. I held up a deed stamped and sealed proof that the foundation of their dreams would never belong to them. Then, with Rachel at my side, I pressed play on the small recorder Leon had delivered. Sabrina's voice filled the air. "She's just dead weight. That old woman will die soon anyway." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Investors shifted, whispers rising like a tide. Derek lunged forward, face red, shouting that it was lies, but the evidence was undeniable. He grabbed his glass and hurled it against the wall, shards raining down, and for a moment I thought he would strike me. Security stepped in, holding him back as his own wife shrank from his side, her mask of control shattering under the weight of public disgrace. That was the moment I had prepared for the third step complete. They had tried to strip me of dignity, but now in front of everyone they had sought to impress, I stripped them of theirs, exposing greed and cruelty for all to see. The room went still after Sabrina's recorded words echoed off the chandeliers, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the brittle clink of a fork sliding off a plate somewhere in the back. Every pair of eyes, from investors in their tailored suits to the waitstaff clutching trays of champagne, turned toward Derek and Sabrina. I could see his face flush crimson, his jaw tight veins bulging at his temple as he realized the walls of his carefully constructed empire were crumbling in real time. Sabrina tried to recover, forcing a laugh that cracked in her throat, murmuring something about jokes taken out of context, but no one smiled. Rachel stepped forward, holding up the legal documents, her voice steady as she announced that my assets were locked beyond their reach, that any attempt to manipulate me was documented, and that copies had already been sent to the district attorney's office. Murmurs spread through the hall like wildfire, and Derek lunged forward, shouting that it was all lies, that I was confused, senile, desperate. His words only deepened the silence because there is nothing more damning than a man shouting down his mother in front of a crowd. I held my ground spine, straight eyes never leaving his, and in that moment, I was not the frail widow he imagined. I was every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every ounce of endurance turned into iron. He swung his arm, trying to shove the microphone away, but security was quicker, grabbing him before his rage could land. The investors stood shaking their heads, and one of his colleagues muttered, "He's finished." Sabrina backed away from him, her mask of loyalty splintering under the weight of survival, because predators eat each other when the hunt goes wrong. She denied knowing anything, her voice trembling as she claimed she was only following Derek's lead, but the recording betrayed her. Leon appeared at the edge of the stage, calm, deliberate, presenting photos of meetings between Sabrina and the notary, timestamps that matched the recordings, proof that both of them had been knee-deep in their conspiracy. The evidence spread across the projector like a confession written in fire. Gasps filled the hall, and someone clapped once, then again, until a ripple of applause broke the silence. Not for Derek, not for Sabrina, but for me, for the mother who refused to be erased. The humiliation was complete. Derek sagged against the guards restraining him, his voice cracking as he screamed that I owed him everything, that without him I was nothing. The irony struck me cold. He had built nothing, and I had given him everything, and still he wanted more. I leaned toward the microphone and spoke softly, but the words carried with a clarity that silenced the applause. I was never an extra mouth. I was the one who fed you, and tonight the world sees the truth. Sabrina burst into tears, mascara streaking down her cheeks, and bolted from the hall, her heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. Derek tried to follow, but the investors blocked his path, their eyes hard with contempt. The contracts he had hoped to sign that night lay scattered and forgotten useless paper in the shadow of his downfall. The humiliation was not private, not whispered behind closed doors. It was public, undeniable, carved into the memory of everyone in that room. For a man who worshipped reputation, it was a death sentence. I stood there, the weight of decades lifting from my shoulders, and I realized that the revenge was not just in protecting my fortune, but in reclaiming my dignity, tearing off the mask they had tried to force upon me, and showing the world that I was not weak, not useless, not expendable. The climax was not in their rage, but in my silence turned to power, and as the applause swelled again louder this time, I let the cold satisfaction wash over me. In the days that followed the gala, the ripples of that night spread wider than I ever expected. Investors pulled their money from Derek's company, contracts were canceled, and whispers turned to headlines in the local paper. Businessman's mother exposes fraud at anniversary celebration. His name, once spoken with admiration in boardrooms, became a cautionary tale muttered over coffee. Sabrina filed for divorce within a week, her lawyer citing irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew it was survival. She packed her designer bags and vanished, leaving Derek to face the storm alone. The district attorney opened an inquiry into the recordings Leon had gathered and the forged paperwork they had attempted to draft. Derek was forced to sit under the glare of fluorescent lights, explaining to investigators how he had conspired to strip his own mother of her home. I did not attend those hearings, but Rachel kept me updated, her voice steady as she detailed how quickly his empire crumbled once truth replaced lies. At home, I walked through my rooms with a new kind of peace. The walls no longer echoed with fear, and the oak tree outside my window seemed to stand taller, as if proud of me for protecting the roots of this family, even when the branches rotted. I poured myself coffee in the mornings and let the sunlight spill across the kitchen, no longer dreading the silence. The documents that once gathered dust in my attic now rested secure in a vault untouchable. With Rachel's guidance, I created a scholarship fund in my late husband's name for young nurses of color who needed help affording school, because I knew too well what it meant to claw for opportunity while carrying the weight of poverty. Each award letter I signed felt like a seed planted where greed had once tried to scorch the earth. As for Angela, she came to me in tears one evening, ashamed for her silence. She confessed she had been too afraid of Derek's temper, too beaten down by Sabrina's sharp tongue to defend me. I listened, I held her, and though the wound of her silence would never fully heal, I forgave her. She at least still had a heart. Derek, on the other hand, was stripped of everything he valued. His investors were gone, his wife abandoned him, and without their schemes to prop him up, he was left exposed as the hollow man he had become. The last I heard, he was working at a small consultancy, his name forever stained. I did not rejoice in his ruin, but I did not grieve it either. It was the harvest of seeds he planted himself. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and crimson, I sat on my porch and let the cool air wash over me. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but so did the weight of justice, and it balanced the scales. I whispered to the night, to my husband's memory, to the decades of sacrifice behind me. We were never weak. We were never useless. And the world knows it now. My story was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the truth, about proving that family is not defined by blood if blood turns to poison. Family is defined by respect, by gratitude, by love that gives and gives without plotting to take. Derek had lost his place at my table long before that gala, but I had regained my place in myself. To those who hear my story, let it remind you, silence can protect, but silence can also betray. Sometimes the only way to be heard is to let your truth roar louder than their greed. I was called an extra mouth, but in the end, my voice became the one that ended their laughter. And as I look toward whatever years remain, I do so with dignity intact, knowing I did not crumble beneath betrayal. I rose above it, and I made sure the world saw me stand. Life has taught me something I want to leave with you tonight. Family is not measured by blood alone, because blood can betray just as deeply as any stranger. True family is measured by respect, by gratitude, and by love that does not vanish when you are no longer useful. My son called me an extra mouth, but I discovered that dignity has a voice louder than greed, and justice always finds its way when we stand firm. If you are listening to this and you have ever been dismissed, ignored, or told you do not matter, remember this: your worth is not defined by their laughter or their cruelty. Your worth is in the sacrifices you made, in the strength you carried, and in the truth you hold. Never let anyone erase you. I hope my story reminds you that it is never too late to reclaim your voice, to draw boundaries, and to rise above betrayal with dignity intact. If this touched your heart, please give this video a like so more people can hear it. Subscribe if you want to stand with me against stories of cruelty and injustice, and in the comments tell me where you are watching from. I love knowing the places and voices gathered around these stories. Together we can remind the world respect and justice are never wasted no matter how late they arrive.